Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. This is Amy Tonimatsu. Welcome to LACOE's Budget Overview for Parents Zoom presentation today. We are doing a joint presentation with our LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit, as well as LACOE's Business Advisory Services. You will be hearing from a few of us today. I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation, and followed by Jennifer Kirk from Business Advisory Services. And our final presenter today will be Evan Bartelheim from the LCAP SFP unit. We also want to acknowledge and thank our other members of Business Advisory Services and LACAP, the LCAP State and Federal Programs unit who are on the call with us today as well. So for those of you who have attended some of our other presentations, we will be using the chat function here in Zoom for Q&A. We're going to be capturing all your questions, and any that we are unable to get to during our presentation and answer today, we will be preparing a Q&A and sending it out to our participants. We want to make sure that we can prepare a thoughtful response and capture all those questions that you have. And we'll be planning to send those out to you early next week. So let's start with the purpose. The purpose of today's presentation is to review the 2020-21 budget overview for parents, including the template, the instructions, and the submission process. There are a couple CDE web addresses that you'll see here on this slide, and this is where you can find information about the budget overview for parents. The template and instructions are found on their LCAP webpage, and the CDE did a presentation as part of their Tuesdays at 2 webinar series on September 22nd. So that second link you see is our Tuesdays at 2 webpage that you might find helpful. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. Since the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted many of the normal operations of our LEAs, there were some changes first that were made by executive order and then by Senate bill, so that districts and LEAs were not required to submit the Local Control and Accountability Plan, also known as the LCAP, and the Budget Overview for Parents, which sometimes we refer to as the BOP, in the spring of 2019. And what typically LEAs would have submitted that in the spring of 2019 prior to the June 30th deadline for the 2020-21 school year. Next slide. But this is not like normal years. And so while that typically the LCAP and budget overview for parents kind of are due together, this year for 2020-2021, the budget overview was what they say decoupled from the LCAP. And so Senate Bill 98 added Education Code 43509, which created the requirements for the 2020-21 Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan, and that replaced just for this year the 2020-21, what would have been the 2020-21 LCAP. And it also changed that same Ed Code 43509, changed the adoption of the budget overview for parents to December 15th, 2020. And that would be adopted in conjunction with the first interim budget report, which LEAs prepare, which also has a deadline for adoption by December 15th. Next slide. Senate Bill 820, it's another Senate bill, also described the updates necessary for the template of the budget overview for parents. Because there's no LCAP, it requires some changes to connect and align it to that learning continuity plan. They required that the template and instructions be updated by September 15th. So as stated earlier, the CDE did so and provided an opportunity for feedback on the draft. And then that final template and instructions they presented at their Tuesdays at 2 webinar on September 22nd. And that was the link I previously mentioned earlier on slide 3. So that was part of SB 820, the preparation update to the new template. So let's take a look at the next slide just to kind of go over some of those differences that we have in the budget overview for parents this year. In general, you'll see that the template, the look of it's very similar to what we're used to seeing, but SB 820 did require a couple key updates. So first, since there is no 2020-21 LCAP, the portion of the budget overview for parents that looks at the current year will be connected to the first interim report and to the 2020-21 Learning Continuity Plan. The portion of the budget overview for parents that looks back at the prior year and reporting of actual expenditures from that prior year will still tie back to the 2019-20 LCAP. And that's why it's said to, that the budget overview for parents are tied to all three of those pieces, the first interim report, the learning continuity plan, as well as the 2019-20 LCAP. Those three pieces are connected to this budget overview. The budget overview for parents will also connect budgeted expenditures, so both the total budgeted expenditures and the total portion that's contributing to increased improved services for unduplicated pupil groups, to the expenditures that are included in your learning continuity plan. So typically where the reporting is tied to your LCAP, this one, the budgeted expenditures that are in your plan will be tied to the expenditures listed in your learning continuity plan. And the last bullet on the slide talks about the additional change to the budget overview template. SB 820 required that this budget overview also specify the total in federal CARES Act funding budgeted by the LEA. So you'll see that included as well. Next slide. And so with that piece on the CARES Act funding being included in the budget overview for parents, these are the funding sources for the ESSER portion, the GEAR portion, as well as the coronavirus relief funds. Those three pieces are the federal sources of CARES Act funding, ESSER, GEAR, and coronavirus relief. There were some other COVID-19 related funding sources, such as the state's Prop 98 General Fund that was packaged as part of the learning loss mitigation funds, but those were state funds. Also, LEAs received the SB 117 COVID response funds, and those were also state funds. So those pieces, the general fund that was packaged as part of learning loss mitigation and the SB 117 funds are not considered part of the federal CARES Act funds as they are state funds. So you'll see that when we get to looking at the data input tab, just understanding that differentiation between federal and state CARES Act funds. So that's an intro. We're going to get a little bit deeper now into the template, and I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone. I will preface this by saying, for most of you on the line, you know that I have little children at home, and right now they are being very well behaved. So let's all say a little prayer for the next few minutes. My portion of today's presentation and overview is going to cover the actual template itself. And just as in past years, the budget overview for parents is an Excel workbook. It consists of 5 tabs. They've actually, CDE has reordered the tabs from what the order that they were in prior years. So when you open the template, you'll notice that you start off with a title page, and it's just a cover sheet for the actual template itself. That's followed by the instructions. There's very detailed instructions on how to complete each of the sections and what information to include. That is then followed by the data input tab. And this is where you'll actually be doing most of your work within the format, within the template itself, is in the data input section. That's followed then by the narrative responses. And the narrative responses will be prompted for you based on the input that you put in the data input section. And that's then followed by the template itself. The template actually populates from the data that's input in the data input section, as well as the narrative responses. So there is no information that will actually need to be input on the template tab itself. So continuing on, this is actually just a screenshot of what the data input tab looks like. And as in prior years, they have not made any changes to it. So it is the same color coding scheme. The yellow is your 2021 revenue. What we like to refer to as the salmon color or peach is the budgeted expenditures. And the green section is going to be your 1920 or prior year budgeted expenditures. This one, what we've done on this tab is we've taken the data input tab and we've annotated it for each of the inputs. And from there, it'll crosswalk as we continue on in the presentation and through the slides where to find each of that specific information. So continuing on, and this is a very convoluted slide, but we will cover each of these areas in greater detail as we move forward this afternoon. But it kind of just cross-references for you to show the yellow section. The yellow section is going to be your budgeted revenue, and that's going to come from Form 1. The salmon section is your budgeted expenditures, which will also come from Form 1, to come from a combination of your actual expenditures in your general ledger and your prior year LCAP. So now we'll continue on into the specific information that you'll input on the data input tab. The information that you'll want to input on the first section is going to be your LEA info. And so you'll input your agency name, your CDS code, and under the LEA contact information, we're asking for the LEA contact specific to the BOP. If that could include your name, telephone number, and email address, that gives us one central point of contact at your district, knowing that there are several of us on both the program and fiscal side that will be reviewing this documentation and corresponding with you. And so it just makes it easier for us to have that one central point of contact. Another little tip that we didn't really talk about earlier, but in addition to annotating each of the input boxes on the template input form, if you hold your cursor over each of those input cells, a little dialogue or comment box pops up and tells you specifically the information that you need to put in there, as well as the instructions. So we've tried to give you as many resources and tools possible to guide and assist as you're completing this documentation or document. So following the district information is going to be inputting your revenues. And these are your projected general fund revenues for the 2021 fiscal year. And these are going to be the revenues as they're presented in your first interim report. So I think I should probably caveat that by saying is that as you completed the BOP as the last document in, you'll also want to complete the BOP as the last document as your first interim report so that you have all of the numbers and the data available to you. So for your total LCFF funds, that's going to come from Form 1, and I believe that that is line A1. And for your total supplemental and concentration funds, that's actually going to be coming from your LCFF calculator. So whether you use the LACOE calculator or the FICNAT calculator, you'll want to make sure that you're pulling that number from the most recently updated calculator that correlates and ties in with the budgeted revenue in your first interim report. Your other state funds will also come from Form 1, and that's going to be, the other local funds are going to come from line A4 on Form 1. That'll be followed by your total federal funds that are coming from line A2 on Form 1. The one change that we have not yet discussed to this form is the addition of your Federal CARES Act funds. And as Amy mentioned earlier, you will be including those amounts on this input tab for inclusion in the BOP. However, you are only going to be including the amount of the federal funds that are budgeted for 2021. So you will not include any of the state portion. And again, the amount to be included on this input cell is going to be the amount that is budgeted for the 2021 year, as you've already obviously spent some of those funds in the 19-20 year. So I think that's just the biggest change. That's really the only change in there. Your total projected revenues on this section will automatically populate. However, it will exclude the amount you input on in area B as your supplemental and concentration funds, as well as F, which is your federal CARES funds. So the total there should also tie to the total on line 5, A5 of your Form 1. So continuing on after this, we just had a quick sample for you, a screenshot or a little snippet of what Form 1 looks like. For any of the program folks on the line today, this might be new to you, or you might not be completely familiar with your form, but your business office is very intimately familiar with this document and can walk you through each of the components of it. And then right below that is a screenshot of the CARES Act summary from CDE, and it's highlighting specifically which areas or which funding sources that you'll want to include in that documentation. And again, as it goes without saying, if you have any questions at any point as you're completing the information on this form, please feel free to reach out to either the business office or your coordinators on the LCAP side, and we are more than happy to guide and assist you as you complete this. So the next section that you'll be completing is going to be the salmon colored section, and that's going to detail out the expenditures, your 2021 expenditures for first interim. And again, these numbers should all tie to what you're presenting to your board and as part of your first interim report. And you're also going to want to refer back to your LCP document that you had approved and submitted on September 30th. So the first line that you'll want to include here is going to be your total budgeted general fund expenditures. That's going to come from Form 1, and it's going to be a combination of the amounts listed on line B9 of Form 1, which is your total expenditures, as well as the amounts included on lines D1B, pardon me, and D2B, kind of a tongue twister, for transfers out and other uses. This was an area that we noticed that got overlooked pretty consistently last year, so we wanted to highlight this and bring this to your attention, that your total general fund expenditures do include the transfers out and other uses lines. That will be followed by the total budgeted expenditures in the learning continuity plan that you submitted to our office at the end of September, and that'll be the total those items that were identified. So from there, you'll want to make sure that when you are adding up the total actions that were identified in your LCP documents, that you be cognizant not to include any expenditures that were listed duplicates. As you've done previously on the LCAP, you had the option to include multiple actions that were funded with one identified funding amount. So just be cognizant to make sure that you're not double counting some of those expenditures. The last line there that you'll want to input is the total budgeted expenditures for high need students that were identified in your LCP. So that would be each of the actions that were included in the LCP that you identified as yes, as contributing for your unduplicated pupils. And again, the total here is calculated for you, and it should be the summation of the amount you inputted as your total budgeted general fund expenditures on line G. And then you would subtract from that the total budgeted expenditures in the LCP in line H. And then depending upon the amounts that are input there, Evan will cover the narrative section. That'll prompt you for a narrative further on. The last section that you'll complete for the input section is going to be your prior year. Oh, pardon me, I apologize. I skipped a few slides. Continuing on, Adrian, you were right, thank you. So this is just a more description of what you're going to be including under your total budgeted expenditures, spelled out a little bit more clearly for you than just the annotated guide that we had. And just clarifying again, anywhere throughout the document where it refers to high need students or where we're referencing your high need students, that is your unduplicated students or those who are low income English learners or foster youth. And I believe the slide following this is an example of Form 1 and on the expenditure section. And I apologize, we had some technical issues earlier with our formatting, but the G that you see on there is line B9 that we referenced for your total expenditures. There should also be a G on lines D1B and D2B. So in this example, this district is showing transfers out of $700,000 that would be added into the 62 million that they're showing as total expenditures on line B9. So the next section, or the last section that you'll complete as part of the input section, is the prior year expenditures, or the expenditures for high need students in the 2019-20 year, so your prior year LCAP year. And for these two areas, you're going to want to refer back to the 1920 LCAP as well as your 1920 general ledger for actuals. So you'll first identify or include the total of actions that you identified in your 1920 LCAP as those that were contributing. So those would be all items that were contributing to your unduplicated pupils, as well as the actual expenditures or the actual amount that you expended. Actual expenditures for the high need students would need to come out of your general ledger. So again, if your program office isn't completely familiar with this, your business office is, and each district tracks and monitors this a little bit differently. But this is an area that you might want to take a look at now and start working and pulling this information together now. This is a section of the BOP that you can complete prior to finalizing your first interim report. And if you haven't actually already calculated the amount that you spent in 1920 on the actions that were identified in your 1920 LCAP, for those that were identified as contributing, you might want to start working on that now so that you don't find yourself in a bind or in a pickle as you get closer to your board date. So I believe, again, we just have another slide that really just kind of details that out a little bit more and provides a little bit more. And it just really simplifies it. In the expenditure prior year expenditure section, you're going to be detailing out the expenditures for high need students in the LCAP and the actual expenditures for those students that you actually spent on those actions. And we've included this in here. It's a little hard to see, but we just wanted to give you a snippet of what your template would look like once you completed that input section. And so it'll end up populating the total amounts as well as some of the specific dollars in the narrative section of the template, as well as each of those dollar amounts will show in a graph as they did last year. And I believe the graphs, we don't have them on here because it was really convoluted, but those graphs will show you the dollar amounts and percentages along with titles. And then there's also a graph on page 2 of the template that will also populate. And this is going to show you your budgeted expenditures in your LCP document as it pertains to what you put in there versus how much were for contributing versus non-contributing. And yes, I saw that there's a quick chat in there. So for your 1920 expenditures for high needs students, you would have those amounts identified either for 1920 or for 2021 in your LCP. And from there, I'd like to turn it on over to Evan, who is going to walk us through the narrative portion of the inputs.
Thanks, Jennifer. And just a reminder, some of you joined us late. Sorry about that link, the Zoom link. Original one was not working, but we are recording this and we do send out a Q&A early next week. So anything you put in the chat, if we aren't able to answer it in real time, we'll definitely address it in the chat. So I wanted to touch base on the narrative responses, which are the second part that you'll have to enter. So the first narrative response is aligned with that peach section of the data input tab that Jennifer has been talking about, and this addresses general fund expenditures. So this prompt is generated if the total general fund expenditures, which are box G, if you've got your handout that we sent out, if that amount is greater than the total budgeted expenditures in the learning continuity plan, which is box H. So it asks the LA to describe any of the general fund budget expenditures that are not included in the learning continuity plan. Next slide, please. So the response is going to vary depending on the LEA. The learning continuity plan actually might have included very few general fund expenditures, since the stated intent of the plan was to describe the LEA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, describing what was not included in the LCP might require a brief overview of general operating expenditures and basic services. Now, the response to this prompt should be brief, but it should also thoroughly describe the LCFF funds that are not included in the learning continuity plan, and it's represented in that dollar amount in the expenditures, not in the learning continuity plan. That's on the data input tab. And make sure when you're drafting this response, keep in mind that the template prefaces this response with the statement, the budgeted expenditures that are not included in the learning continuity plan will be used for the following, just so it's a sentence frame, so you make sure that you kind of make it fit with what's included. Also note there's a space limitation. The space available, I actually wrote 400 lines. That's inaccurate. It's 400 pixels. Thank you, Amy. I'm like drawing blank here. It's 400 pixels. It's approximately 300 words. The CDE said not more than 75 words, which would be next to impossible. But we know there is a limit, and so you might want to draft it and drop it in and make sure that it can be resized to fit everything, because it can get cut off. So just make sure you can do that. That's if you're using this template. If you're using something else like doc tracking or another, they might have more flexibility. Just be aware that the CDE template does have a space limit. So next slide, please. So narrative response number 2 is related to the budget amount for high need students in the 2020-21 school year. And this prompt connects to both the goldenrod section in the data input, as well as the PEAT section of the data input tab. And this response is needed if the amount of the total budgeted expenditures for high need students in the learning continuity plan, box I, is less than the amount of the LCFF supplemental and concentration grants, which is box B up at the top in your revenue section. And so if that's the case, the LEA must respond to the prompt and provide a brief description of the additional actions the LEA is taking to meet its requirement to increase or improve services for high need students. Next slide, please. So in this narrative, describe the additional actions that you're taking to meet the LCFF's increased or improved services requirement. And note that the second prompt in the learning continuity plan's increased or improved services section actually already asked you this. So when you submit a learning continuity plan, that the increased or improved services section asked you to describe any actions that were not in the plan that were contributing to increased or improved services. So this narrative should be consistent with what was described in the learning continuity plan in that section. And when drafting this response, make sure you note that the template prefaces this response with the statement, the additional improved services described in the plan include the following. This response is also limited, like I said, somewhere around 300 words. Make sure you're brief but thorough. Next slide, please. So the final prompt is related to the green section of the actual expenditures for high need students. So if the amount of the actual expenditures for high need students in the LCAP, which is we've identified as box K, is less than the total budgeted expenditures for high need students in the LCAP, which was J, the LEA must respond and provide a brief description of how the difference impacted the actions and services and overall increased or improved services for high need students in the 1920 fiscal year. Next slide, please. So of course, 1920 was a very different year than many, so we expect there will be some major differences. So in this narrative, you're being asked to describe the impact of the difference, the underspending, and it had on the ability for the district to increase or improve services to students. And as we said last year, we really encourage you just to be honest. There's no penalty for being honest. And while you can briefly explain, and there are some real reasons why you may have budgeted a certain amount for a teacher and that cost was less than you budgeted, that's fine. But you should also make sure to focus on the effect that the lesser amount had on providing support for students. It's really critical that you're very direct. And we expect that last year, because of the disruption, there are probably going to be lots of impacts on our unduplicated pupil groups. So when drafting this response, the template prefaces the response with the statement, the difference between the budgeted and the actual expenditures of blank dollars had the following impact on the LEA's ability to increase or improve services for high need students. So next slide, please. So as far as the process goes, the adoption process, it's recommended that the LEAs present their 2021 budget overview for parents for adoption at the same public meeting at which the first interim report is approved by the governing board. And just in terms of public hearing, we've had a lot of questions that came up related to a public hearing if one's necessary. And at the September 22 CDE webinar, which I've included a link to here, the CDE indicated that it's not required to have a public hearing for this, that the CDE is of the opinion that there was robust stakeholder engagement process around both last year's LCAP as well as learning continuity plan, and that that should be sufficient. So you would be presenting this as an action item for adoption, so there would be opportunity for public comment then as well. Next slide, please. So the LEAs must submit their budget overview for parents to LACOE in conjunction with their first interim report on or before December 15th, 2020. And we are also noting, charter schools are also included in this. Now, charter schools must submit their first interim report to the chartering authority and the county superintendent of schools, just to be clear. And also note that the first interim report is submitted as a hard copy to our business advisory services team. The BOP will be saved as a PDF and uploaded into our ELCAP system. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So they're separated upon submission. So don't email your BOP to have a whole process. We'll be sharing in just a minute. Next slide, please. So we, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, we'll be reviewing the documents, and the county office will be looking at both at the BOP, both the data input page as well as the narrative section, and of course ultimately the template, which makes sure that's legible to everyone. So we're looking for accuracy of amounts entered in the data input table, including the revenues, budgeted expenditures in the learning continuity plan, and prior year planned expenditures. We'll be looking to make sure there's consistency with what's been posted there. And we'll also be looking at the narrative responses to make sure that they address the budget overview instructions. And note, because there was not a requirement for the LEA to upload, if there have been any changes to the learning continuity plan, that was not in the legislation, although we know that many LEAs have made some modifications to their learning continuity plan, and those may include a change in the amounts of budgeted expenditures, or could include a shifting of an action from contributing to not contributing. We'll be reviewing what's been uploaded into the ELCAP system, so make sure you have, for the learning continuity plan, the most recently updated learning continuity plan to be consistent with what's in the budget overview. Next slide, please. Legislation included the posting requirements. So once everything has been reviewed and approved, make sure it's posted. The budget overview for parents should be posted on your homepage along with the learning continuity plan. Hopefully you've got that up there already, as well as LCAP federal addendum. Next slide, please. So the template for the budget overview is available at this link on the CDE website, and the instructions are also available at those links. And next slide, please. And so I just want to note, in the past, we actually have asked, well, it was different, I guess, when we had the LCAP. But for the purposes of review, it certainly would be helpful if when you save the PDF of the budget overview, that you actually save the data input table, the narrative response, and the template, and upload those. That'll allow us to see everything and be able to review them. Sometimes in the template section, things will get cut off, so it's good to have the narrative response page. Allows us to read the whole thing, and I know that our BS team loves the data input table. It's way easier to read that and compare that than going through the narrative sections and finding all the numbers and putting them in the right order. So for the final posting to your website, though, only the template page is required for the budget overview, but just for the purposes of the review, please upload. You could just save the whole thing and upload it. And just to note, I was playing around earlier with it. You still have to resize. So if you have, once you've posted everything, not only the narrative responses have to be resized on the template page, so you can double click on the cell border to expand, or you can manually expand the sections, but also the charts in some cases aren't fully visible. So make sure after you've entered everything, you take a look at that template tab and make sure you resize so everything is visible. Next slide. So I want to start off by saying, of course, you're going to have a while before you can finish this because the first interim report has a limitation on it. But we are updating the LACOE ELCAP system. This functionality isn't there yet, so I don't want you, but we have it's in beta testing right now. So we did get some screenshots of it. But when it comes time to upload the budget overview, you're going to use our ELCAP system. And most of you may be already familiar with this because we've already used it to upload the written report to the community, the learning continuity plan, and if you're lucky, CSI prompts. So the first thing you need to do is log into the LCAP system with your same username and password, or if you don't have one, you can register a new name here. And once you're logged in, you're going to click on the link for the budget overview for parents. And then you'll be able to, you'll see this table generated and they'll say add budget overview for parents. That's how you get started. Next slide, please. And then once you're there, you're going to just fill out this contact information sheet, the board approval date, list that as the date at which you submitted your budget overview to your governing board, all the contact information, and then you're going to choose your file. Again, make sure it's a PDF. It won't upload anything, and also try not to put any random characters like ampersands or pound signs. Those types of things sometimes can make it difficult to upload. And once you've selected the file, you're going to click the green upload button. Make sure to do that, and then you're going to click submit. Submit is the final function that'll send it to the county. You may want to save if you don't have the file ready. If you just wanted to create the shell and wish to upload it, you can also fill out all your contact information and click save, and it'll stay there and be accessible. As soon as you click submit, though, it's formally submitted. Next slide, please. So we just have our contact information for the state and federal programs, LCAP unit. There's our phone number and our email, and then the coordinators. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And I've got the links below there to our page. We'll send out to everybody who's registered our Q&A follow-up, but we generally post both the video for all our presentations and all the documentation and follow-up on our LCAP page. So just be on the lookout. If you don't get the email for some reason, make sure you visit our page. And then next slide, we've got our business advisory services team. Jennifer, who presented, has been so gracious as to be the main contact person. So if you have any questions, feel free to send her an email or any of the business services consultants that you may have worked with in the past. The next slide, please. So finally, if you have questions still, we're going to keep the chat open and you can feel free to submit your questions. We don't answer all of them in real time because we do want to provide a thoughtful answer, and many of you have such great questions that we couldn't probably answer in real time anyway because they're so detailed. But please enter those, and then like I said, we will get out a follow-up Q&A early next week, and we'll have that the video recording, the archive of this meeting uploaded as well for anybody who wants to watch it a second time. Anyway, thank you for joining us today, and we will be talking to you soon.